They will tell you that evil is obvious, that you can see it in the eyes of a predator, in the twisted grin of a monster. But that's a lie. Real evil hides in plain sight. Sometimes it wears a Sunday dress, carries a worn leather Bible, and whispers prayers with a voice so tender you'd never imagine it was the very same voice that condemned its victims to die. In the small, God-fearing communities of North Carolina during the 1970s, people lived by trust. They let their neighbors into their homes, they shared casseroles and hymns, and they never once imagined that the warm hand of a grandmother could also be the hand of death. Velma Barfield was that grandmother. To look at her was to see devotion, humility, and compassion. She was a church woman, a caregiver, a figure of safety in a world where people still believed in the strength of faith and family. Yet beneath that gentle exterior was something darker, a secret hunger, a quiet calculation, a willingness to use poisoned prayer, and the illusion of love as weapons sharper than any blade. Her story is not just the tale of one woman's descent into murder. It is a revelation about the fragility of human trust and the way institutions, church, family, even medicine, can become the perfect masks for evil. She did not need shadows to hide in. She hid in the light. She was not feared, she was beloved, and that made her more dangerous than any killer lurking in the night. Before we go further, I want you to do two things. First, subscribe, because what you're about to hear is knowledge that others would prefer remain buried. Second, comment below with the state you're watching from. I need to know how far the shadow of Velma's story travels, because make no mistake, this tale could have unfolded in your town, on your street, inside your own family. So lean closer. Forget the idea that killers look like monsters. Tonight, I'm going to show you that the deadliest face of all can look like your grandmother's. The first thing you must understand is this: Velma Barfield was not born a monster. That is the most unsettling truth. Monsters are easy to dismiss, creatures that arrive twisted, already set apart from the rest of us. But Velma came from the soil of ordinary life, raised in the cracked, red fields of Carolina, molded by the same forces that shaped thousands of good, honest families. That is why her story cuts so deep. It proves that within the same roots of poverty, faith, and tradition that build communities, something poisonous can grow. Velma's childhood was forged in hardship. A household of 9 siblings, ruled by strict Pentecostal principles, where God's word was law and obedience was survival. Their home had no electricity, no running water. The kind of poverty that forces children into adulthood long before their time. She was a bright student, quiet, obedient, with the makings of someone who could rise above her circumstances. But in that house, dreams were luxuries. When her mother gave birth to twins, Velma's basketball team, her one taste of freedom, was taken from her. Her hands that once held a ball now held wash rags, cooking pans, crying infants. And then came Thomas Burke, a boy with humor in his voice and gentleness in his manner, so unlike the stern hand of her father. At 17, Velma chose escape disguised as love. Marriage was her rebellion, her path out. But what she ran toward was not salvation. It was the first chapter in a long descent. For 20 years they played house like countless young couples. But the veneer cracked in 1965 when Thomas, shattered by a car accident, turned to alcohol to numb his agony. This is where you must pay attention. Pain is the gateway, not just physical pain, but emotional, unfulfilled lives, crushed dreams, humiliation. Pain is the soil where something darker can take root. Velma watched her husband drown in it, his faith in God dissolving in liquor, his presence in the home shifting from protector to burden. She fought to control him, to save him, but what she was really learning was that suffering could be manipulated. That weakness could be weaponized. What do you think happens to a woman taught to submit, who realizes for the first time that death itself can be a form of power? That lesson would come soon, and when it did, the line between caregiver and executioner vanished forever. April 4th, 1969, the night that changed everything. The night Velma crossed the line from silent suffering to something far more calculated. Picture the scene: a modest wooden home, the walls heavy with years of tension, poverty, and unspoken bitterness. Thomas had been drinking again, his body wrecked by headaches that felt like knives behind the eyes, his spirit crushed by unemployment and failure. He was not the boy Velma had once laughed with. He was a burden, a reminder of promises that never came true. That night, Velma made a decision cloaked in routine. She gathered her children, said she had errands to run, and left Thomas alone in the house. It was a small detail, but a fatal one. Neighbors would remember later how unusual it was. Velma rarely left at night, and never with both children in tow. Hours later, flames devoured the Burke home. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was already a glowing skeleton collapsing in on itself. Inside, they found Thomas's body in the bedroom. The official story: he had fallen asleep smoking a cigarette, a tragically common fate in rural America. The community grieved. They saw Velma's weeping, her body collapsing with grief so raw it had to be restrained at the burning house. At the funeral, she played her role with perfection, the broken widow, thanking neighbors for their prayers, speaking softly of Thomas's suffering and clutching her children with trembling arms. No one doubted her. Why would they? In a town where a person's word was as binding as a contract, the image of a grieving wife was untouchable. But beneath the ashes, suspicion lingered. Some noticed how Velma had moved family photographs and jewelry out of the house days before the fire. Others whispered about the insurance payout that came swiftly, stacked with community donations and sympathy. For the first time in her life, Velma had money, more than she had ever held in her hands. Widowhood had given her freedom and wealth. Here is where you must listen closely. Tragedy can be an accident once, twice is coincidence. But when loss becomes profitable, when grief becomes a mask for gain, that is the seed of something more sinister. Velma discovered a hidden truth that night: that murder, if performed with careful hands, could appear to the world as misfortune. And no one questions the tears of a widow. That fire was not just the end of Thomas Burke's life. It was the birth of Velma Barfield, the grandmother who learned that death could be crafted like an art, and that trust itself was the perfect weapon. Widowhood did not slow her, it accelerated her. Only 16 months after Thomas's death, Velma stood at another altar. This time not as a frightened teenager escaping her father's house, but as a practiced woman who had learned the value of timing, opportunity, and presentation. The man was Jennings Barfield, a respected widower, wealthy by local standards, with land, business interests, and a reputation for honesty that reached across Cumberland County. To him, Velma was a gift, a woman of faith, gentle with his children, devoted to church, skilled at running a household. What he could not see was that her devotion was not to God or family, it was to control, survival, and the quiet high of secrecy. At first, their marriage looked perfect, almost enviable. Velma threw herself into her new role like a woman who had been waiting all her life to perform it. She cooked with precision, she kept the home immaculate, she even managed Jennings's books and business correspondence. To the outside world, they were a model family, two people who had lost much but found stability again in each other. But under that surface, cracks were already forming. Velma's dependency on prescription drugs was no longer just a coping mechanism, it was a hunger. Valium, Librium, antidepressants, each pill was a step deeper into a private fog where responsibility could not reach her. But drugs cost money, and her new husband, unlike Thomas, kept careful watch over his accounts. Velma adapted. She forged checks, withdrew small sums, forged his signature until it became second nature. She stole not for luxury, but for sustenance. Her pills were her lifeline, her armor, her secret ritual. When Jennings began to suspect, he confronted her with the blunt force of a man who did not tolerate betrayal. Unlike her first husband, weakened by injury and addiction, Jennings was strong, decisive, unwilling to be manipulated by tears. He threatened divorce, threatened to expose her, to drag her carefully crafted mask into the light of the courthouse and community. That threat was unforgivable. This is the moment, the pivot you must understand. To Velma, being unmasked was worse than murder. Murder left her free. Exposure left her powerless. In her mind, the solution was simple. If a man threatens to take away her freedom, her reputation, her access to the mask, then the man must die. So the gentle grandmother began to prepare, not with rage, but with the cold patience of someone who had already tasted the power of orchestrated death. Jennings Barfield, respected man of God and community, had no idea that the woman at his dinner table was already rehearsing his funeral. It began with stomach pain, subtle at first, the kind of discomfort any hardworking man might dismiss as a bad meal or indigestion. But Velma knew what she was doing. She had studied human frailty her entire life, watched her father's moods shift with cruelty, watched Thomas wither under alcohol's poison, and she had learned a terrifying lesson. Suffering looks ordinary until it doesn't. Jennings's pain grew sharper, violent, and unrelenting. He vomited until his body trembled, collapsed in waves of nausea that no medicine could explain. And through it all, Velma remained by his side, the dutiful wife praying over his body, whispering comfort. pressing cool cloths to his forehead while the very poison she had slipped into his food consumed him from the inside. This was Velma's genius. She didn't lurk in shadows. She didn't hide in alleys. She poisoned in daylight at the family table and cloaked herself in compassion. While Jennings groaned in agony, she was his angel of mercy, kneeling beside him, clasping his hand, her lips murmuring prayers. Every visitor, every neighbor who saw her, walked away convinced she was a woman of God, tested by tragedy but unwavering in faith. Jennings, however, grew suspicious. In his final days, even through the fog of torment, he voiced concerns, questions about his finances, about the sudden illnesses, about Velma's growing desperation. But suspicion doesn't survive long against poison. By March of 1971, Jennings was dead. Another funeral, another widow's tears, another sympathetic community rallying to the side of the grieving grandmother. But this time, the cover was even stronger. You see, Jennings's death was explained away as natural causes. In rural America, where autopsies were rare, where the church's word carried more weight than medical science, no one dared suspect that a respected man had been murdered by his devout wife. Velma's mask did not crack, it strengthened. And here is where her transformation locked into place. Velma realized she didn't just have the power to end a life, she had the power to shape reality itself. If she cried, the world believed her sorrow. If she prayed, they believed in her faith. She could commit murder in plain sight, and society itself would defend her innocence. Understand this: evil at its most dangerous does not fight the system, it uses the system as its shield. Velma had discovered that the church, the community, and even the law would protect her as long as she played her part. After Jennings, Velma's mask was no longer just a disguise, it was her weapon. And with each death, her confidence grew. She had learned the rhythm of deception, the subtle dose of poison, the slow decline, the prayers whispered over a body writhing in agony, and the performance of grief that disarmed every question. It became a cycle, almost ritualistic, and with each cycle, she sank deeper into the quiet intoxication of power. But there was another hunger gnawing at her: the pills, Librium, Valium, antidepressants. Her veins didn't crave blood, they craved chemicals. She was a grandmother, yes, but behind that soft image was a woman enslaved by addiction. Every theft, every forgery, every manipulation was designed to feed this private empire of pills. In her world, deception and poison were not opposites, they were the same. Both gave her control, both allowed her to bend reality to her will, and so more people began to suffer. Neighbors, relatives, men who trusted her, elderly souls who welcomed her care. They shared meals with her, they leaned on her kindness, and then they fell, one by one, to the same cycle of pain, vomiting, and inexplicable death. She was always there, always the first to call for prayer, always the one who wept hardest at funerals. And each time, suspicion drifted further away from her and deeper into the shadows where no one looked. Here is the lesson, one the world would prefer you never learn: people believe what comforts them. Communities would rather believe in tragedy than in betrayal. They will swallow the story of heart failure or gastroenteritis because it allows them to keep their faith in the goodness of those they love. Velma understood this weakness and weaponized it. But there's something even darker to recognize here. The institutions, church, family medicine, did not stop her. They shielded her. They amplified her illusion. The white gown of the nurse, the hymns of the church, the tears of the widow, all became her camouflage. She had discovered the perfect formula: cloak poison with prayer, and no one dares to doubt you. The deeper truth is this: Velma wasn't just killing individuals. She was dismantling the very foundation of trust itself, and she proved that once trust is broken, reality itself can be rewritten. And yet this is only the beginning, because her downfall didn't come from strangers or doctors, it came from the cracks within her own mask. Cracks that eventually became impossible to hide. Patterns always betray the predator. For years, Velma's crimes passed as isolated tragedies: husbands lost to illness, neighbors gone too soon, family members struck by mysterious ailments. But death has a rhythm, and in Cumberland County, whispers began to echo through the church pews and across kitchen tables. Why did so many around Velma fall ill? Why was she always present, always the grieving widow, the consoling friend, the caretaker? At first, these were whispers smothered by pity. After all, wasn't Velma the woman of God who had suffered so much loss herself? Wasn't it cruel to suspect the one person who stood faithfully by every deathbed? But suspicion doesn't die easily. It lingers in silence until someone dares to give it voice. The cracks began to show after Jennings's death. Bank records hinted at forgery. Family members noticed pills missing from their cabinets. Neighbors remembered how often Velma helped prepare food for the sick. Little things too small to prove, but enough to unsettle. Doctors began to note the strangeness of her victims' symptoms: violent vomiting, relentless stomach pain, sudden collapse. Illness, yes, but illness that seemed too consistent, too staged, as if each patient were reading from the same tragic script. Velma felt the eyes beginning to turn, and yet she leaned harder into her role. She doubled down on prayer meetings, volunteered more at church, spoke more often about the battle between God and Satan. Her tears flowed easily, her Bible was never out of reach, and her voice trembled with piety at just the right moments. The more doubt spread, the deeper she buried herself in the armor of faith. But here is where psychology cuts sharpest. Velma's addiction and need for control grew faster than her ability to hide them. The forgeries increased. The overdoses became harder to dismiss. Her hands shook from withdrawal when she went too long without pills. She wasn't just poisoning bodies anymore. She was poisoning her own mask. And slowly, those around her began to choose suspicion over comfort. A nurse whispered to a doctor. A neighbor warned another family. A sheriff's deputy muttered that too many funerals bore Velma's shadow. The system that once shielded her was beginning to stir, reluctant but restless. This is the paradox of evil. For a time, it thrives in silence. But the more it repeats itself, the louder the silence becomes, until even the blind must squint toward the truth. Velma's reign of quiet death was nearing its fracture point. The walls began to close in quietly at first. A sheriff, long accustomed to the rhythms of his small town, noticed that Velma's name appeared too often in reports of sudden illness and death. A doctor, curious about recurring symptoms, scribbled a note to himself: arsenic. And within the community, where funerals had become far too common, people whispered with a nervous certainty. Death seemed to follow Velma like a shadow that never left her side. The investigation didn't begin with sirens or handcuffs. It began with paperwork. Forged checks surfaced, stolen money traced back to her desperate need for pills. The authorities might have ignored one crime, even two, but Velma's trail was too sloppy now. Each forgery, each prescription scam, each unexplained death layered suspicion upon suspicion until the weight became impossible to ignore. Then came the autopsies, the very thing Velma had always counted on avoiding. For years, rural custom had spared her that risk. Death was considered private, almost sacred, not something to be dissected. But science was catching up, and when samples of her victims' tissues were tested, the results were undeniable: arsenic. Not in trace amounts, not accidental, but lethal, deliberate, impossible to explain away. This was the moment the mask cracked. Velma, once the weeping widow and saintly grandmother, was now whispered about in darker tones. The woman who prayed over every coffin was suddenly being called a black widow, a poisoner, a fraud. Her name, once spoken with pity, now carried suspicion sharp enough to cut. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, Velma clung to her performance. In interrogations, she spoke softly, invoked her faith, and painted herself as a victim of circumstance. A woman broken by loss and driven into mistakes. She wept for the investigators, just as she had wept for the neighbors, the doctors, the ministers. But the tears no longer worked. The act that had shielded her for decades was losing its power. The truth was out. Velma Barfield, grandmother, churchgoer, and caretaker, had left a trail of bodies behind her. And though she tried to drown the world in her rehearsed sorrow, the arsenic in those bodies spoke louder than her tears ever could. Her downfall had begun. Not with a dramatic confession, but with the simple, undeniable voice of science tearing through the illusions she had so carefully built. The day of her arrest was eerily quiet. No chase, no struggle, just the soft shuffle of a grandmother led away in handcuffs. For neighbors, it was almost unthinkable. The same woman who had sung hymns beside them on Sundays, who had bowed her head in prayer at every funeral, was now accused of being a killer. But the evidence was immovable. The forged checks, the trail of pills, and, most damning of all, the lethal doses of arsenic traced directly to her victims. In the courtroom, Velma tried to resurrect her mask. She sat demurely, Bible in hand, eyes lowered, the very image of a woman who had suffered more than she had caused. Her defense leaned heavily on her troubled childhood, her abusive marriages, her addiction. They painted her as a broken soul, more deserving of pity than punishment. But the prosecution was merciless. They laid out the pattern of her crimes with clinical precision, each death recounted like a chapter in a chilling book. The jurors did not see a grieving widow. They saw a predator cloaked in prayer. Witness after witness took the stand, their words carving away the last fragments of her disguise. Neighbors spoke of sudden illnesses, doctors described the agonizing symptoms of poisoning, and experts held up lab results as proof of deliberate murder. Even her surviving relatives, torn between love and horror, could not deny the weight of the evidence. And then came the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence: death. Velma Barfield was now not only the first woman sentenced to die in the modern era of American executions, she was the symbol of something society had long denied: that evil could come wrapped in gentleness, that the face of a grandmother could hide the soul of a killer. Yet even in the shadow of death, Velma's story took one final, haunting turn. Behind prison walls, she claimed to have found redemption. She became a devout Christian, counseling fellow inmates, writing letters of repentance, and insisting that God had forgiven her. For some, this transformation was sincere; for others, it was just another mask, another performance perfected under the weight of mortality. But the state of North Carolina was unmoved. No prayer, no tears, no testimony of faith could erase the arsenic buried in the bodies of her victims. The date of her execution was set, and Velma Barfield's life of deception and death was now counting down to its final hour. The prison cell became Velma Barfield's final stage. Stripped of the neighborhood kitchens, the hospital rooms, and the church pews where she once played her part, she now lived under the relentless gaze of guards, reporters, and fellow inmates who knew her not as a grandmother, but as the death row woman. And yet, she embraced this spotlight with a strange calm. To some, it seemed she had truly found God in her confinement. To others, it was just another performance, her last desperate attempt to write the ending of her story on her own terms. Velma began corresponding with ministers, journalists, even strangers who wrote to her out of morbid fascination. In her letters, she admitted guilt, spoke of repentance, and preached the saving power of Christ. She sang hymns in the prison chapel, prayed over other inmates, and spoke of peace while awaiting her own violent end. For a time it worked. People began to debate whether her execution was justice or cruelty. Was she still the monster who poisoned her loved ones? Or had she become a redeemed soul, a cautionary tale of sin transformed into salvation? But outside the prison walls, the families of her victims had no doubts. They lived with the memory of loved ones gasping for breath, their bodies twisting in pain from arsenic coursing through their veins. Redemption did not erase graves. Forgiveness did not bring the dead back to life. For them, Velma's newfound faith was just another mask, one they refused to accept. As her execution date drew closer, public interest exploded. She became the first woman in over 2 decades scheduled to face the ultimate punishment in America. Protesters gathered at the prison gates, some holding candles in prayer, others holding signs demanding her death. The air was electric with tension. On November 2, 1984, the countdown ended. Velma Barfield was led into the execution chamber, strapped to the gurney, and prepared for the lethal injection. She spoke soft final words, not of terror, but of faith. "I know that God has forgiven me," she whispered, her voice calm, almost tender. Moments later, the poison coursed through her veins, ironically not unlike the deaths she had inflicted on others. Within minutes, she was gone. Velma Barfield entered history not only as a killer, but as the first woman executed in the modern era of America's death penalty. Her case became a grim reminder of 2 truths: that evil can wear a gentle face, and that even at the threshold of death, some killers cling to the belief that their story belongs to God, not justice. In the weeks after her death, the echoes of Velma Barfield's story rippled far beyond the prison walls. Newspapers filled with headlines that drew in readers who could scarcely believe that a soft-spoken grandmother had been the first woman in over 2 decades to die by state execution. Talk shows debated her case, preachers referenced her redemption, and legal scholars dissected the chilling irony of a woman who killed with poison only to be killed by one herself. For some, Velma's execution was a victory, a long-awaited justice for the families who had buried loved ones stolen in the most insidious way. These families could finally close a chapter that had once been filled with unanswered questions and whispers of suspicion. But closure did not erase the trauma. To this day, her victims' relatives recall not only the agony of those final illnesses, but the betrayal of discovering that Velma, the very person they had trusted to care for their mothers, husbands, and siblings, had been the architect of their suffering. Others, however, clung to a different narrative. To them, Velma Barfield was proof that even the most broken of souls could find grace in the shadow of death. They cited her prison ministry, her public repentance, and the letters she wrote begging others to turn away from addiction, crime, and despair. In their eyes, she became almost saint-like, a woman who had sinned unimaginably, yet been washed clean before her final breath. But history is rarely so merciful. Velma's story has since become a cautionary tale in the darker annals of American crime. She represents the dangerous intersection of addiction, desperation, and deception, showing how the mask of faith and kindness can hide something far more sinister. Her case forced America to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about women as killers, but about the thin line between forgiveness and accountability. To this day, criminologists point to Velma as an example of the maternal poisoner, someone who hides lethal intent beneath the guise of caregiving. The very archetype that made her invisible for so long, grandmotherly, religious, nurturing, was also the camouflage that allowed her to operate without suspicion. And in that, her story remains deeply unsettling. Velma Barfield's execution was not just the end of a woman. It was the unmasking of a truth society had long resisted. Evil does not always snarl or shout. Sometimes it prays, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it looks exactly like someone you would trust with your life. In the decades that followed, Velma Barfield's story became more than a headline. It became a mirror that forced society to confront its blind spots, to question how easily we accept appearances and how quickly we excuse certain behaviors when wrapped in a cloak of faith, femininity, or fragility. For centuries, the archetype of the killer had been painted in masculine tones, brutal men with knives, guns, or fists. Women, on the other hand, were seen as nurturers, caretakers, incapable of the same cold violence. Velma shattered that illusion. Her method, poison, was chillingly consistent with historical patterns of female killers. It was subtle, drawn out, almost invisible until it was too late. Unlike a bullet or a blade, poison does not leave an immediate scar. It works quietly, infiltrating the body, eroding trust in the most intimate spaces, homes, kitchens, hospitals. Velma weaponized trust itself. She fed pills to husbands, mixed drinks for neighbors, prepared food for relatives, all with the hand of a caregiver and the heart of a predator. That duality, more than anything, is what makes her story so unsettling. Psychologists studying Velma's life argue that her crimes cannot be understood without acknowledging her addictions, traumas, and losses. Yet these explanations fall short of justification. Many suffer, many fall into despair, but not all choose murder as a solution. What set Velma apart was her ability to weave deception so seamlessly into her everyday life. She did not kill in a frenzy of rage. She killed in silence, in patience, in prayer. She was methodical. She was deliberate. She was, in her own way, a predator hiding in plain sight. Her execution reignited debates that continue even today. Can redemption erase atrocity? Should forgiveness lessen accountability? And most chillingly, if evil can wear the mask of kindness so convincingly, how do we ever truly know whom to trust? Velma's case did not just add to the annals of crime, it rewrote the way society viewed women who kill, proving that monstrosity is not bound by gender, nor by age, nor even by outward appearances of holiness. And so her legacy lingers, whispered in criminology classes, dissected in true crime documentaries, retold in books and articles. Not because she was the most prolific of killers. She wasn't. But because she was proof that sometimes the most dangerous face of evil is the one that looks most like salvation. Today, Velma Barfield's name surfaces not just in history books, but in the endless fascination of true crime culture. She appears in podcasts, documentaries, and late-night conversations where people wonder aloud how someone so outwardly gentle could harbor such darkness. And each time her story is retold, the same unsettling questions rise again. How many other Velmas have walked among us, their secrets hidden beneath kindness? How many killers have been overlooked because they didn't fit the stereotype? Her case is often used as a warning to challenge assumptions. We expect killers to look monstrous, to act erratic, to reveal themselves in ways that align with our fears. But Velma teaches us that evil does not always announce itself. It can sit across the table from you, serving dinner. It can hold your hand while you're sick, whispering words of comfort. It can even bow its head in prayer, asking God for blessings while plotting your death. For the true crime community, Velma Barfield is both fascinating and terrifying because she embodies the idea that trust can be fatal. Unlike the notorious killers who stalked strangers in dark alleys, Velma destroyed the people who loved her most, using intimacy itself as her weapon. In doing so, she shattered the illusion of safety within the family, within the home, within the sacred bonds of care. Her story also continues to shape discussions of the death penalty, especially when it comes to women. Some argue that her execution was necessary to affirm justice, that gender should never shield anyone from consequences. Others believe her execution was an example of the state's coldness, extinguishing a woman who, in their eyes, had been spiritually reborn. These debates linger unresolved because Velma's case resists easy answers. She was not simply a villain, nor a victim, nor a martyr. She was all of these at once, depending on who you ask. And that is why her legacy endures, not because of the number of her victims, but because of the mirror she held up to society. Velma Barfield forces us to reckon with a chilling truth: monsters are rarely strangers lurking in the shadows. More often, they are the ones sitting closest to us, wearing the face of someone we trust. And so, as the prison lights dimmed on the night of November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield became more than just a name in the court records of North Carolina. She became a symbol, a reminder that evil does not come to us wrapped in shadows and menace, but often in warmth, in prayer, in the ordinary rituals of daily life. She was a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor, a churchgoer. She was also a murderer who turned trust into a weapon and mercy into a mask. The haunting truth of her story is not only in what she did, but in what it reveals about us. We crave patterns, categories, monsters we can point to and say, there, that is evil. But Velma refused to fit the mold. She lived in the spaces we don't want to look at, the gray areas where love and violence, redemption and destruction, faith and betrayal all intertwine. And that is why her story lingers, decades later, whispering in our ears that what we fear most may not be the stranger in the dark, but the familiar face smiling across the table. Every time her story is retold, whether in court transcripts, psychology lectures, or true crime documentaries, it unsettles something deep inside us, because we realize that if Velma could exist, if someone so ordinary could carry poison in her purse and scripture in her heart, then perhaps evil is not as rare, not as distant as we wish to believe. Perhaps it hides much closer than we dare imagine. So when you lock your doors at night, when you glance at the faces you trust most, ask yourself this chilling question: how well do we really know the people around us? And remember, sometimes the deadliest hand is the one that reaches out to comfort you.